You've had a look at 3 representative institutions of higher education and at the large numbers of people, programs, and activities that each institution administers. Now the question is, who makes the big decisions? The institution itself or a higher body? In other words, the question to look at in this session is, what is the political context of higher education? How much power or autonomy does each institution have? Well, universities are said to have a lot of autonomy, and they're said to be protective of it.
Universities are very jealous about their autonomy, and that's not simply because we want to be distant, but there is an advantage in each university going slightly its own way, in that it provides, I think, a great diversity and allows each university to develop its own particular stamp.
Now, what does a university's autonomy involve? Glenn Jones and Michael Skolnick, both of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, each gave me their definitions.
Institutional autonomy is a very important concept in the study of higher education. It essentially relates to the notion of freedom or independence that an institution has over its functions and over how it accomplishes the tasks it sets out to accomplish.
Autonomy is quite simply having the freedom to run your own affairs. And now in the case of, when we use the term university autonomy, we usually mean freedom from whom? Freedom from the government, because universities may be subject to a lot of controls from other parties.
But recognizing that higher education is largely funded from the public purse, isn't there a conflict between institutional autonomy and accountability? Susan Clark, Vice President Academic at Brock, suggested this in the Curriculum Theory and Design course.
Universities have traditionally been very jealous of their autonomy, and yet it's a very guarded autonomy in the sense that, of course, we're dependent on the public funding to a very, very large extent. And so there's always tension between how much individual autonomy the institution has versus how much direction we should take from the government.
When it comes to systems where we publicly fund to the extent that we do in Ontario and in Canada generally, using institutional autonomy as an excuse not to be more transparent in terms of how the money is spent and not to be more transparent about accountability is something that doesn't wash. And the public at large and the elected officials from all 3 parties in Ontario want to see far more accountability on the fiscal side. So when it comes to institutional autonomy, let's separate out for fiscal matters from academic matters. And once you do that, I think you get into very different kinds of discussions about what protections are necessary on the one hand and what transparency there has to be on the other for the activities of the university.
Okay, we've established that institutional autonomy is a highly protected freedom held by universities to establish and accomplish goals and objectives. And it receives its greatest criticism when it is perceived to be an excuse for insufficient accountability. Our next task is to look at institutional autonomy comparatively, first with other universities.
There's no doubt that Canadian universities have as high or higher level of institutional autonomy compared with almost any other public system in the world. For one thing, the governments in Canada have really restricted themselves in terms of intervening directly in the affairs of the universities. There's been relatively little direct intervention, and the universities have therefore been free to make their own decisions in terms of programs, to make the determination in terms of what faculties they will be creating, etc. And in many respects have been given a degree-granting monopoly by the provincial governments. We really only have 1 or 2 private institutions in Canada, so the public sector in Canada really is the only game in town in terms of Canadian higher education. That is quite different than you would find in some other countries, where governments have been much more likely to intervene, where there's been a higher tolerance of direct intervention in terms of institutional autonomy, and where in some other countries, especially the United States, of course, where the market plays such a large force, where because of the funding mechanisms and student aid programs, where universities are actively trying to recruit students and to some extent must cater to students. And that can also be viewed as a kind of intervention within institutional autonomy.
I thought it would also be interesting to ask John Dennison to compare the levels of autonomy between Canadian colleges and universities.
Colleges in many provinces were designed to have a fair degree of autonomy. They were given the mandate to respond to community needs in the ways they saw fit. The problem was that colleges became the victims of their own success. Their popularity, the demand that were placed upon their services was so great that the programs were developed rapidly. Every year they expanded, and immediately government became concerned about this. And in recent years they've become even more concerned. So government, the only way government can control costs is to exercise some control over program development and budget. And to do this, of course, you move into greater centralization, greater intrusion of government into the colleges. And this has been the trend in recent years.